are grants from the U.S. Department of Education. And so I helped Austin write, and then 4 or 5 other school districts write proposals that were funded eventually into 3, and then another round of 2 grants I helped the district write another district budget those grants. So that's where I'm coming from today.
Thanks, and Jen will be back with some slides later on to talk specifically about some of her real current work that's going on. But before we get into that, my introduction, right? Okay, so anybody who's read that bio knows that my background was a policy background. I started out as things like newspaper reporter and Boy Scout executive, and I moved on from that to community education coordinator to a member of the state legislature. Now, I know that's a joke, but that's what happened. I was young, and in fact, my wife was pregnant every general election I was in. 3 general elections, 3 kids. They were always 2 years apart in school. We found out what caused it was elections. So, Senator, I don't know, 3 young kids. Just a warning. And I have to update that now because obviously I'm older. In fact, Social Security eligible, is that what they say? 62. So the update is my oldest daughter, that's the first grandchild. He's now 9 months old. So after I was in the legislature, I went to work for the national conference. Well, actually, I should say that I worked for a governor, and I was executive assistant to the governor of government policy. So my background again is a very much a policy one. Then I moved on to, after I left office, to be nonpartisan or bipartisan, working for the National Conference of State Legislatures. That's Denver-based, so in 1987, I moved out to Denver and started working with state policymakers, mostly education committee members, education committee chairs around the country on issues in school finance and school governance and major school reform. And so within 6 or 7 years, right shortly after, I was one of the people that came into Kentucky to assist the legislature as they responded to the Rose Court case. I was one of the consultants, and then I helped set up or recommend how to set up the group that was going to assist. And so you had 3 committees, and you had consultants to those committees, and I was participated with them in various ways, but most of all with John Abubuik, because John was the one who led your finance portion of that work. And within a few years, I actually joined him, and it was Abubuik and Myers as a consulting firm for about 10 years. Then I decided I'd like to do some of my own things, and so I went on my own for 18 months before they invited me back. When I came back, I said, don't change the name. It's bad enough the way it is. Abubuik Palacian Associates, there's no sense in that another name for that. But I've worked with them off and on then since 2000, well, full-time then since 2005. So what did we do? And in order to introduce that, that's what I was going to put under the one of the major points of this presentation. And the major points are what's possible with paying educators differently. Now, originally it says alternative teacher count, but that is really a little misleading. It's not the best title. I remember when we first started in Denver, they talked about merit pay and pay for performance, and then eventually landed on professional compensation, and now it's shortened to ProComp as their alternative teacher pay program. I don't like any of those kinds of things. So lately we've been talking about how to pay educators differently, and that implies a lot of things that you heard in the first panel. In fact, the cliff notes for this group is we'll talk a little more about salaries, but we will talk a lot in the same way the previous panel did, which is there is a quilt of things that need to happen. Performance-based compensation systems are a complex series of things. Compensation is a slice of that. So we're going to talk about what's possible. What's possible is to use these performance-based compensation approaches to assist you to create that human capital management system or that quilt of activities that has to happen. Okay, we'll talk about early examples. We'll talk about the U.S. Department's Teacher Incentive Fund grants. It's one of the largest areas where there currently more specific about performance-based compensation systems, and we'll talk a little bit about what research shows. Okay, for anybody who has to leave early, here's the real quick cliff notes, okay? The cliff notes is merit pay doesn't work. We'll get that out when we get to, so what do I mean by that? Merit pay means where you're trying to pay teachers and principals, or whoever, based upon standardized test scores. Why? Because the standardized test scores we have available are one-year snapshots. There's a year grades 3 through 8 typically, and maybe a few more end of course kinds of things. But the bottom line is those were designed in order to be able to pay for growth in student learning. That's what you want to pay for. You want to pay for growth in student learning. And they are very hard to use, even though we'll talk value added a little bit, value added assessment, use of assessments for value added purposes. But the bottom line is that no one should be held accountable for an examination of something that is not what we really want to achieve. So the bottom line is that's the big summary, and so that summary plus the second big summary, which is teachers ought to be equal partners in helping make decisions. Teachers and principals. So how did we learn that? How did we get to that point? Well, we got there because of some of the early adopters. And here's another bottom line. Bottom line is state programs for the most part haven't worked. What do I mean by that? You look at Florida, you look at Texas, and we are very involved in Texas and helping with the Austin program. And what we know is those statewide programs have really fallen short of being able to help create these kind of quality alternative compensation systems. And again, primarily because they rely too much on the standardized tests, the merit pay side of the equation. The one example up there that has had a little bit of success is Minnesota QCOM. That was a case where the state actually gave a per pupil dollar amount that was available to school districts who self-chose the opportunity to try to improve mostly professional development opportunities, and so there was more freedom in that system than Florida or Texas. Now, what programs do I think have worked, and we have, I believe, research that shows they have worked? They are those places that have very consciously involved teachers and very consciously involved the community in trying to say, here's our expectations for how we should be paying teachers and principals differently. Okay? And our examples, and I can give you others, there are some from a number of places. Our examples are Denver and Denver ProCom. Denver had a 4-year pilot program of merit pay, and then they evaluated it, and the evaluation was then used to create a task force, and that task force, I was hired to be the facilitator for a task force. Equal numbers of teacher and teacher leaders with equal numbers of administrators from the district, and a broad community-involved group of, that included local foundations, it included the mayor, who is now governor, it included a lot of people that took an interest in this new way of paying professionals in Denver public schools. That program ended up with 4 major component parts and 13 deeper parts. I won't go into detail of that unless you have questions, and we'll give you plenty of time for questions. And we'll get more detail after for those that are able to stay around for the second. After Denver ProCom, we worked in several places. Montana is one. So I give you a sense of the smaller schools as well as bigger schools, or bigger districts that do this. And then in addition is Austin's strategic compensation plan for 3 years. I facilitated their steering committee. Their steering committee put together a plan. This was based upon some local money that was put in and continued over a period of time before they were and they piloted it in some of their districts, starting with 9, went to 11, 16, 33, and now with the new TIP grant, they're up to Up to 33,
Like
okay.
up to 33.
Okay. So those are how many school sites they have, so schools as opposed to the district. So they're still not full-wide, district-wide. But again, in Austin, the key components of that were teacher engagement, the key components were supports as well as rewards, and that the rewards were thoughtfully put together, meaning that you could have professional development rewards, you could have rewards that were tied to student learning relative to student learning objectives. Just like in Denver, they put student growth objectives. I was in the room when they decided on that term, and they didn't like the acronym, I guess it is SLO, because it said slow. So those of you who are working now nationally, when we talk about this, student learning objectives is what they talk about, and so they're slows. Okay. So, I have Houston up there is also an early adopter, and I have it up there, we didn't work there, but as a response to a place that they have managed to continue to aspire over a period of time, but that early work was really concerning because they had so many times when, well, it was a value added, they used value added research in order to do the exams. There were teachers that were paid that should have been paid, there were teachers who weren't paid and should be paid, and so the early implementation was very important to the systems. And so they had a long ways to go to try to take that alternative teacher pay program and ramp it to the point where it can be accepted in any way. Still a concern, although they have been, they continue to be a district that benefits from the teacher incentive fund grants. Let me talk, and I will again spend more time later on talking about the teacher incentive fund grants. And teacher incentive funds started in 2006, and in 2006 they, I lost my notes. In 2006, started by awarding some grants using the system that I say doesn't work very well. And that is a system whereby it's primarily based upon a standardized test score reward. And so there were two rounds, 2006 and 2009, that did that. A total of 36 grants were awarded during that period of time. Then in 2010, there was a rethinking at the U.S. Department of how to proceed with these. And the rethinking suggested a more comprehensive approach. The rethinking allowed for recognition of teacher engagement involvement. It allowed for rewards to include supports, teacher leadership positions, etc. And so there were 62 awards made by TIF3 in 2010. Those are the ones that Jen will talk a little more specifics about. The ones we got involved, we helped write 4 of the successful TIF3 grants. And out of those resulted in some programs that we think are being successful now. And we'll talk about research toward the end. And then finally in 2012, TIF4 came in, and 30 awards were made that year. Now, actually, I want to step back to TIF3 for a second. In TIF3, there was an opportunity for districts to be involved in what was called a evaluation pool. The U.S. Department was trying to determine whether research exists on those that are successful. And there were originally 13 grants made in that area, and it's down to under 10. Nine grants now that are involved in it because they required a random assignment of school sites in terms of who is going to receive the alternative teacher pay in a flat dollar amount and those that are going to receive teacher pay in a variable amount. And I don't need to get into detail of it and tell you Mathematica is a national group that was doing that evaluation pool. We recommended that people we were working with not to do that, and in hindsight, I think we were right. There are real struggles. We continue to assist a little bit with Jefferson County, Colorado, which was one of those sites. So we can talk more about the strengths and weaknesses of the U.S. departments trying to get evaluation on these alternative teaching things if you are interested in your questions. Okay, tip 4. Tip 4, there were 30 grants awarded in 2012. 6 of them were specifically around STEM programs, in other words, math and science programs. And so, again, those are fairly brand new. They're just kind of getting started. And Jen will talk more about tip 4 when we move on to that section. I will say that the districts that we worked with that were successful in tip 3, you see up on the board, and I'll particularly underline, I've worked with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards for 15 years, with a little bit of my time. And that time was always around state policy, so any of the state policymakers that want to trim around that, I got. The bottom line is that whether it's the National Research Council report or other sets of research that's out there, clearly shows that the National Board identifies accomplished teaching and that those accomplished teachers have higher student performance gain. There are very few things you can say that about. Very few things yet. Master's degrees, not universally. In fact, research is fairly clear that a master's degree, unless it's subject matter specific or in early grades, and the specific, the majority of those impact the student performance. You can go to good, high-quality professional development does in certain unique situations, but about 98% of what we do right now doesn't. So there are a lot of those kinds of things we'll talk a little more when we get to the research on. Bottom line here is the National Board is one of the things it does. We work with them specifically to create a grant that says, let's try to align the core propositions of the National Board with a new alternative approach to paying people. And we did that, we're doing that with 5 school districts in Maine, the state of Maine, and in Richmond, Virginia. Again, we'll talk more about that. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about tip 4 and specifically work that she's been doing with New Haven and anything else I left out. Other than to say that as part of tip 4, she helped write the grant for the state of Maine where they were adding 6 more districts. So what?
All right, so I'm kind of doing my job as to pick up the quilt analogy and to really think about how, what this quilt looks like in the context of these federal grant opportunities. Can you just, I know this is silly in terms of active participation, but can you raise your hand if you worked on like a Race to the Top grant or a teacher incentive fund grant? So there are a few folks in the room that know that they're pretty complicated, right? They have a lot of different core elements or some of the terms that the federal government uses. So you have to meet these core elements.
And before we go on further, let me ask another. I've had on my list of things to do and didn't do. And that is, are any of you working currently in a place where you say you have alternative teacher pay, that you're paying teachers differently? Yeah, that's what I thought, because there's no teacher incentive.
Kentucky pays an extra $2,000 stipend for national board certified.
Yes. And there's some teams on it. Okay. Good, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good foundation to build on. Another discussion. So the tip 3 grant competition, as John alluded to, required the core elements were the new teacher evaluation system that guided pay. So you had to pay if your teachers were rated effective or higher. And job-embedded professional development. Historically, CPC didn't really identify exactly what the teacher evaluation systems needed. It didn't really say what does job-embedded and targeted professional development look like. So districts had some quite, they didn't have many constraints in terms of developing their systems. And so tip 4 came along, and I kind of vowed to stay far, far away from it. But then I got a call from you. And so what tip 4 required was really more deeply about your performance-based compensation systems, using your educator evaluation as the driver for, this is another fun term, your human capital management system. So, if you can follow this. So your human capital management, in very general terms, is sort of a way to pull HR into conversations about school development, really. So how do you get your HR departments to identify the right teachers, place the right teachers, involved in growing your teachers and retaining your teachers? So a lot of the conversation that we had this morning about that big quilt, right, of how school systems really operate, is where TIP 4 kind of came in. So the federal government was really asking districts or states to think about how these teacher evaluation systems inform other parts of running your school system. And I didn't want any part of it. I really didn't. But I didn't have the expertise. I had not run school districts, right? And I didn't know the extent to which teacher evaluation systems really worked and really gave you valuable information to inform all of these components of your human capital management system. And then about this time last year, I got a call from Garth Aries, who's the assistant superintendent in New Haven Public Schools. And if this TIP 4 grant was written for any district in the country, it was written for New Haven Public Schools. So we need to go back in time a little bit to 2009. And New Haven engaged in a really intense negotiation with their union. So it was a very, really model example of labor management negotiations to reconstruct their union contract. And that union contract enabled these teacher evaluations to exist, so that labor management came to the table to develop a new teacher evaluation system. TMTP, which Andy had referenced, was at the table helping them think through it. Ultimately, it was really New Haven's baby. But they developed a really thoughtful teacher evaluation system that had components of many other teacher evaluation systems like Charlotte Danielson and Bob Marzano's, and really came up with, they call it the Cartesian matrix, right? So you have on one side your teacher performance that's driven by standardized tests when you can use them, and other measures. So those other measures, like John kind of alluded to, are student learning objectives, and all the districts that I work in, they call that student learning objectives.
I know.
And for me, the power of student learning objectives is that it gives you a context for having a conversation between a teacher and a principal, and grounded in data, right? And it's not just student performance data, but it's really who are your kids in your classroom? Tell me about your kids in your classroom. What are your goals for them this year? How are you going to move from September to May or September to June, whatever your school year is, and let's set some goals together. And in New Haven, they had very intentional check-ins. So there was a first year, or beginning of the year conference, middle of the year conference, and end of the year conference. And then while there's this Cartesian matrix, which is basically just a matrix, right? And it's a real organic conversation that takes place in New Haven. And so you have the student learning objectives on the left, and then along the top are this professional values conversation. So what's happening in New Haven after 3 years of implementing these teacher evaluation systems is a conversation about, well, what do we know about teacher growth as professionals, and how do we talked a little bit about it throughout the past couple of days, but how do we professionalize this, phrase. So the conversations are around how can I identify my teacher leaders? How can I help my teacher leaders grow? It's one of our first forays into having teacher leaders is really about this lateral component in terms of job and professional development. I've had conversations with some folks in the room about how do you carve out that time to engage in these conversations, peer-to-peer conversations, and know who's really good at differentiation, or who's really good at questioning in your school, who really understands these Common Core state standards, who can I go to have this conversation, and across the board, teachers don't necessarily know that, right? Principals, don't necessarily know that. So these systems are really helping us identify those strengths and weaknesses of the people that work in our schools. So it's pretty powerful. And so the federal investments in that help kind of launch this work. So that's why we chose to kind of travel down the federal dollar route to help you think about how you can leverage these opportunities in your state. I have one more thing that I'm going to say now.
When you think about it, you can come back. And you already will notice, by the way, that we're down, we only have 2 slides left. So we have one on research, and so we're going to have a lot of time for questions and answers. In fact, we violated a little bit. It's my view that no one should speak in front of a group longer than 7 minutes without being interrupted. And so I hope that you will begin to think about that and have your questions ready for us. So we covered a number of things. I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about money, because I'm a school finance guy by background, and whenever I'm talking to people, I know there are state legislators in the audience, I want to make sure to talk about money. And what we know in Denver, for example, there was a $25 million bond issue that was put on the ballot and passed. In fact, I am not aware, there are a handful of places that have put on the ballot additional funding for education tied to alternative teacher training. To my knowledge, everyone is passed. So what's possible here is more money for teachers. How much more money was that? Well, that is a debate. That $25 million was to help transition and to implement, but at that moment in time, it would have been about a 12% average raise in Denver. So if you're thinking about doing a comprehensive alternative teacher pay program, that's one way to think about it. Now, one example, anecdotal. It's not good research here to talk about the dollars needed, but there are some dollars. The interesting thing in Denver is that when we first looked at their existing salary schedule and plotted it over time with the expectations of when teachers would leave the system and retire, et cetera, the existing system wasn't fundable over time. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, but it was in Denver's case. Colorado has a very strict taxpayers' bill of rights, budget and tax limitations on local level and state level. And that combination means we could assume how much money was going to be available in the future. And we knew when we started, and both the teachers union and the administrators knew, the existing salary schedule was not fundable over time, given our assumptions. So when I say there was a 12% additional money, well, compared to what becomes the question. But we believe, we're pretty sure teachers have more money in salaries than they would have had it not passed. So that's cool. In Austin, when they started theirs, they had what they called a 1 penny. So what you would compare to in other places, a 1 mil levy, maybe that raised $4 million. So they started piloting, and they started piloting based upon that $4 million. And then we assisted them with the stand up and have the microphone on. We assisted them with the TIF3 grant, and that was the largest TIF grant ever given, and it was for how much money?
$63 million over 5 years, and it basically ramped up and then ramped down. She had to show a match in the TIF3, so it went from, I think, 14 million to 15 to 16, and then back down to 14 million per year for these 44. Well, we budgeted for 44 schools, so really at 32.
Right, so those, and to give you some idea, both Austin and Denver have about 80,000 students, so that gives you some size thinking with this, because it's not like you do it in terms of size as well as percentages. In addition to that, I would say that this is just a random guess, because I don't think we have very good numbers on how much. What we know about teacher incentive fund grants is they've given out $1.5 billion total appropriated from the federal government up until 2011-12. Now that sounds like a lot of money, right? Well, put it in context again. Remember, there is $600 billion a year spent on K-12 education. So, and out of that, 40–50% goes to salaries, right? I mean, you could actually, it's probably higher than that, but if you just want to do the big picture, random numbers, we have the $600 billion we spend every year on K-12, and out of that, 40 or 50% is going to go to salaries and benefits. So when you think of it in those terms, that $1.5 billion spent over 6 years is not a lot of money. And what we know is there are some other experimentation going on with alternative teacher pay. Clearly, the largest number of grants out of the Teacher Incentive Fund have gone to NIET. That is, some of you will know that as the TAP program, the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching. And it's the Milken Foundation supported effort to get into alternative teacher pay. They're very specific about a career ladder and very clear about what percentage of teachers can get in a performance pay and how to go about that. And it also includes master teacher and mentor teachers. So that is the predominant, most, if you look across the country, that would be the most if you see in
in New Haven, just to kind of piggyback on that, using the data we know from the past grants, we kind of budgeted for about $7,000 in stipends for teachers. But one of the opportunities in TIP 4 is to also leverage this money to shift the salary schedule. So they're actually in negotiations right now to really lay the foundation for engaging in those conversations about how to take the salary schedule as we know it away. So taking away the steps and lanes, so additional pay for each year that you teach, and then additional pay for master's degrees, and replace it with, obviously there are negotiations, so it's not clear exactly yet. But some ideas on the table are replacing that with effective ratings year over year, and then have some safe harbors so that you can't go down in salary that much, but you have the opportunities to go up. And then the opportunities are also related to teacher leader opportunities too, so really identifying what your teacher leader needs are within each school district. So there'll be some really amazing things coming soon with these TIP 4 grants, but like I said, the foundation is just being laid.
Jen anticipated the transition to talking about research. In the future, we're going to find out whether these things work very well. We anticipate that some of them will work. But the bottom line is the early research on the early adopters, particularly those that stayed with rounds 1 and 2 of TIF, they were evaluated by the National Center on Performance Incentives, Nashville, Tennessee-based group, and they basically found that again, merit pay didn't work. Okay? And in fact, even in the places where we would argue that, I'll strip down the bottom, we have local evaluation research that's done in Austin, Texas by the Austin research folks that did quality research. There are a few things that work, but they have a very difficult time tying that back to actually paying for student performance growth. What they did find was paying teachers for student learning objectives, where there were in the schools, and I mentioned that as strategic compensation in Austin, they changed the name to REACH. And so in the REACH schools in 2009 and 10, where the teachers set and met their SLOs, so the higher percentage of those who set and met SLOs, their schools had a better improvement in comparable growth. That was something specific to Texas, but it is student performance based. Okay? It was their students. And those schools that did not, even schools in REACH that did not set as high standards or met a higher percentage of teachers met, they didn't do as well. So, And there also was there's a group called the Community Training Assistance Center that Slotnick runs out of Boston. He's been a part of several of these. We work with him in both Denver and in Austin. Bill's group has looked very closely at some of this work, and what we show here is research on his early work in Denver that tied together the successful completion of student learning objectives and growth of student learning. I mentioned in tip 3, Mathematica is doing I'm not aware of the full results. There's some initial work out that doesn't change basically what I was saying. So with that, I think we are ready. Oh, and here are the resources that are available. Some of the work that we would suggest if you want to look more at. And there are several good websites, including if you just go to the U.S. Department's ed.gov, put in Teacher Incentive Fund, you can get a list. I got it up right now of every grant that's been provided. With that, we're going to turn over to questions. So feel free to ask us about any of the issues that we've brought up. We find this interesting work, and we're glad to try to answer questions.
Thank you. And you guys shared about the grants. Are there other alternative models out there, like supply and demand models, career ladder models that you guys are seeing being experimented with or that are working in other places? We heard one of our speakers earlier saying that his son was a physics major, wasn't going into education. Are there models out there dealing with some of those things?
In Massachusetts, they ran a program about 10 years ago to recruit math teachers into their schools and gave, I think, like $20,000 bonuses. And they actually found that it didn't work. It didn't retain math teachers. It recruited them, certainly, but it didn't help retain them. So it's back to the Hilton analogy, right? What would have helped math teachers stay is the question that, as a community, I think we should think deeper about. In terms of the retention efforts, I mean, you can look to any number of these programs to understand teacher retention, and typically it's around working conditions in very general terms. So thinking about what life is like in a school. If you're in New York City, principal leadership, right? If you're in New York City, sometimes it's just about having a safe place to park your car. So if you drive to school, so some of those kinds of other,
Where did you teach?
I didn't teach in New York City.
But in terms of other models like low-performing schools with differentiated pay to attract higher teachers, are those types of models out there?
There are a few examples. For examples, even in the National Board arena, where National Board certified teachers get a stipend, but if they teach in a hard-to-serve, hard-to-staff school, they get a Denver Pro-Com included in it a provision that paid additional dollars to teachers in high-needs areas and in high-needs schools. So they do an evaluation every year of what are their highest need schools and what are their highest need teaching positions, and then gave one of. So there are some examples.
Yes, Stu, I would say in all of the tip 4 grants and all the tip 3 grants, every school that's funded by those dollars has to be at least 50% green Spanish. So if that's one way that you're defining high need, the federal government is really pushing districts to think about that and providing money to help with those incentives. So you could really take a look at all tip 3 and tip 4 grantees to understand that. But I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. There are models that offer stipends for attracting teachers into high-need schools.
And again, tip 4 has the 6 grantees who are specifically around STEM programs. Marianne?
Good morning. Have most of these programs that you all would call are successful, even if all the research has not been done, added to a level of what's perceived to be at least quasi-adequate compensation to begin with? And I ask that question because most Kentucky teachers are taking home significantly less money today than they were 5 years ago. Outside of a few school districts that have been able to give raises with local monies, teachers' school years have been cut, they're paying more for their health insurance and retirement. So when you take a system that's already badly inadequate and give a few pots of money to a few people, seems like that creates some significant issues.
Well, let me address the first part of your comment, which is, I agree totally that the starting point ought to be to think about what is adequate compensation to begin with. And there are very few places in the country where you would say it's there. There are some, but there are very few places. Now, having said that, Denver is a good example. I already told you about the budget and tax limitation issues in Denver, and so what the teacher leaders there did said, you know, we can see what the future brings, and we're not going to be able to raise that base any other way. There isn't any other way that we're going to get the money we're going to want for increases without agreeing to doing something different and to pay our teachers differently. The other thing I would say is that we have found in those systems that have the teachers involved in helping make the decisions, that those decisions are ones that include a variety of teaching options, a variety of stipends, that include teacher leadership, includes performance, we call them EDUs in Texas, professional development units, all of those kinds of things, and teachers support that. So they do not see, and when a teacher is worried about their own classroom's SLOs, then they don't see that as competition with their neighbor, right? And and so it depends on how you do it. If you go back to Tier 1, if you go back to traditional merit pay, and you're saying we're going to take your standardized test score and compare it again, remember, 35%, about 35% of teachers are in the tested areas. That means that the majority of your teachers are not going to be in an area where you're going to have a value-added score or a standardized test score to be able to use. So you have to use multiple measures, and so when you do that, then there is less, quote, competition among the teaching community because they've been a part of helping design it. They have lots of options as to how they want to get there. In Denver, I remember at the time we did it, there were some changes since then, but at the time, and this was back quite a few years ago now, we were talking about where the cap was kind of like $60,000 for a teacher. We could see a $100,000 teacher if the teacher did everything, right? And some of them were on their way to do that, and then they changed the system a little bit. We can talk about that more later on if you have questions. But the bottom line is this gives the opportunity to attract the young teacher that is excited about doing something different than they earlier. And I missed your second half.
Whether or not teachers are adequately paid.
No, that's the first part. What's the second part?
It's all the same.
I did it all? Okay,
And
great.
I would add, what we found was so fascinating in Austin is this development of syllabus, which, as I explained, really offer the opportunity for teachers and principals to engage in these really meaningful conversations. So powerful.
We can't hear you. Can't hear you at all.
Just lift it up.
Is it wrong?
Or yes.
So this powerful conversation exists with individual teachers and individual principals on SLOs, and what naturally evolved in Austin was this notion of team SLOs. So teams of teachers going in and engaging in conversations with their principals to set their student learning objectives. It was fascinating. So the team examples could be grade level teams. So your first grade teacher is going in and having these powerful conversations about what we're going to do as a team with all of our first graders. Like I said, it was a natural evolution that these individual SLOs prompted in these tiny schools in Austin.
Other questions?
Yes, I've got one here. So I'm sorry if I missed it, but could you go back and say, when you say merit pay doesn't work, what do you mean it doesn't work? And so I actually have sort of two questions. So one, what are you defining as, is it that test scores go, the student performance goes up? Is it something about teacher satisfaction? Is it actually retention? What is a good working system do? So that's one question. Second is, in Kentucky, where our professional growth system is looking at including the student survey information as one of the multiple measures. I'm just interested if any of these are using that as one of the multiple measures.
I always jump to the last part first because that's the part I'm interested in. So remember your first part of the question, we might have to come back to it. There is real interest in evaluations these days. And what we know is the growth in interest in evaluations has led to more and more work on SLOs. And the reason is because of this non-testing kind of area. So, but the early adopters here did not tie student stipends, teacher stipends for performance or for any reason to evaluation. That's just been recently added to the alternatives to compensation evaluation. And that's maybe an overgeneralization because there were some experimentation with it, but the big ones that we were focused on didn't include. And they thought about it, they looked at it closely, but the reason they didn't move forward was that because they knew the current state of what was available. And the data and information available wasn't good enough to differentiate between high performers and between high performers and medium high performers, or medium high performers and low performers. What we know is the existing evaluation system was very crude instruments that just identified a few bad performers, and that's it. Didn't do anything else. And one would argue we didn't do that very well. And so that's why the early systems that looked at this didn't include evaluation. Evaluation has come in very recently. I would argue by the federal government's 10% of the money, because I should explain that, I guess. You realize that out of that $600 billion we spend, 45% is state money, 45% is local money, 10% is federal money. Even under the expanded years of the global stimulus package, and we made a lot of changes based upon the marginal money and race to the top. This is all marginal money because it went up to a high of 11.7%. And it's come down again to about 10% as a federal share of K-12 education funding. And so I got off on that.
I'll go back to the first question. So it's about merit pay and whether or not it works. So I'm going to answer this in terms of research. So in education, to address a comment that Bill made earlier, the notion of the research base is really weak. And so in our understanding in our community of what research is also very weak. So the merit pay conversation that John referenced is in terms of like the gold standard of evaluation. So you want to just understand what one thing does to affect performance. And that one thing was whether or not teachers, if you gave teachers more money for higher student performance, does that work? Just one thing. What? To increase student performance, right? On standardized tests. So it's just measuring one thing, and that's out of the Vanderbilt NC5, which is the National Center for Performance Statistics. Yeah. So it's really a crude, back to this crude notion. It's a crude understanding of what works in education.
John, you may have answered this a few minutes ago. I heard Andy say that with some of the new evaluation systems, we're beginning to see all teachers getting the same evaluations again. In other words, we're not really differentiating. In the programs that are using the SLOs, student learning objectives, is that beginning to really differentiate between stronger and weaker teachers? Or are we going to get, I think the fear is everybody's going to get a high evaluation and get the higher pay, and then we really don't have the dollars to cover those new salaries.
Yeah, one of the important things we've done is try to estimate how many teachers will achieve at these various levels, whether it's on SLOs or an evaluation or whatever pieces. And we've learned over time the variation in that. And because we have some school-wide awards based upon state data, that's Texas as an example, that changes so often, it's really hard to answer. Now, to specifically answer your SLO question, I would say that there are a lot of things that we've learned in teacher evaluation. And for interest, I have recently worked for this state department in Nebraska around the teacher and principal evaluation system to create the nuance system. Okay, so a lot of the thing I'm going to talk about now is related to their work. They're trying to pilot SLOs as part of their new evaluation system. But it's broader than that. It's in the quilt idea. You know, SLOs alone, to do them well is going to change things and be positive in certain environments. I don't know that at this point can be used to say that's the silver bullet number of the evaluation. It's not. We know from the METS study, and I will underline again, I'm not fond of the researchers, as Jen says, I'm a policy guy, who come out and say value-added research on standardized test scores is the answer. Well, that's what was used to evaluate the METS study. Now, it did find that student surveys are very high predictor of the student performance growth using value-added research. So student surveys, peer evaluation and review. We've worked with several places, Jefferson County, Colorado, New Haven, there's some others. Those have been shown to be successful from my evaluation, from researchers we do. So there, if those are all part of the pieces, if you're doing evaluation, the METS study from the Gates Foundation, measuring education effectiveness of teachers, you know, has strengths and weaknesses. I've talked about the weaknesses. The strength is that they've identified this multiple need for multiple measures and the need for multiple ways of looking at evaluation.
So I would really answer that question just slightly differently. First by saying, Andy's right, we are identifying 85% of our teachers are effective or higher. But what if our teachers are good? You know, what if we really have great 85% of our teachers are great? We have to celebrate that, right? And to dig deeper into your question, Cindy, I think that we do see some differentiation in the student learning objectives. And so in Austin, each teacher had a set 2. And not, I want to say like 50% of teachers in Austin, so we had about 1,800 teachers in the system, 50% met both objectives, and like 85% met at least one. And where we did see stronger effects, so the student learning objectives is this notion that you have a pre and a post test within your current school year. And that can be a teacher-created assessment, it could be an authentic assessment, so like if you're a music teacher, you could have performance that you're measuring students with. So you can't, and you can't use standardized tests on this. But when you take your SLOs and match them to your standardized tests to understand the effects of creating these SLOs, we found that with math teachers in middle school, the effects were higher. That's why we didn't put it up there. Austin has a fantastic research team as part of embedded in their district. So they have about 10 people on the research team. And they post their research. So you can really dig deeper into some of these questions that you have. So if you go to AISP.org, I think it is, and then search for REACH, it'll pull up that page, and you can see that research.
Yeah, I was going.
Just be loud. Here we go.
I'll go back to Mary Gordon's question on the mayor pay not working kind of thing. And I guess the piece that strikes me is in Kentucky right now, we're not going to stay doing this, but we have advanced Kentucky where teachers are being rewarded for increased numbers of kids taking and passing AP classes. Which seen some significant movement. Maybe more movement than we've seen in anything else we've done. Personally, I've watched the school with dismal enrollment numbers in AP classes in math and science skyrocket, and the passing rate skyrocket. Now, part of that incentive was also the kids were receiving some incentives, so that kind of went hand in hand. But I think that's a model that we need to be looking at.
Yeah, so really engaging in that high standard and high expectation conversation. So high expectations that teachers have for students.
Questions?
We're a statewide organization, and my takeaway is the success stories that you are highlighting have been local efforts. At the beginning of your presentation, you had a couple states listed, and in fact, got this right. They weren't very successful, and we talked about more local initiatives. So, as we sit here and look at this from a more global, statewide perspective, is this really an issue that needs to be tackled at the local district level?
My view is yes. There are people in the alternative teacher pay movement who would come back and say, I'm wrong, that anything you can do to get additional dollars to teachers who have high success of their students, the better off you are. I don't buy that because I believe you're successful by doing things with people rather than to them. And I think when you start out with a merit-based system, as I define it, as we talked about it, you're doing things to people rather than with them. And we know that in whether it's our small consulting firm, or we know that whether it's in business as a general. I mean, the truth is, you're successful when you're working with your employees, you're working with your people. Because there's more knowledge out there than there is in here, I guarantee you, when you come to doing these things. Yes, I would argue that the state programs have not been thoughtful enough about how to work with the teachers and principals in those schools in order to implement these systems.
So if you were advising us,
I would incentivize local school districts to put together their own plan.
okay, so
And I would require, as part of that, significant engagement. Theoretically, the teacher incentive fund does that, and in some places they do, and in some places they don't.
So what's the role for the statewide advocacy organization like Pritchard as it relates, particularly, you probably found this in other states, we have 2 or 3 large urban districts and then a lot of rural districts. So what if you're advising us, I want some free advice here, tell us what we as a statewide organization need to be doing.
Well, I would support the state setting aside some money, a small leverage money, again, that helps pay for some of the beginning discussions, pays for that steering committee, pays for that teacher engagement process, if you would, that has more discussions about this. I think you're going to need it just with the new evaluation system. Why not include that in this multi-layer teacher pipeline from recruitment to induction to, and include in it the National Board models. And by the way, yeah, I'll leave it there.
So I think that you stand on we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? We're all learning from each other. And I think what you can take to the state level is what John just said, right? Articulating to the state, like, and a pot of money, more like Minnesota did, a per pupil funding pot of money, right? To create these types of programs. You might not want to call them incentive programs, right? You might want to call them human capital management systems to learn functional programs. But really, it's really how do you leverage these opportunities to engage in deeper and more meaningful conversations about student learning between teachers and principals, I would argue. I mean, no offense to the fine superintendents in the room, but I mean, this is really about what happens in a school and in classrooms.
And the other thing I would add, as this is my school finance hat, is we still haven't solved all of our